and welcome to Crowvane Manor. Wherever you are, and whatever kind of night it's been, you've come to the right place to slow down. Let the world go quiet for a while. Out here, none of it needs your attention. Many of you return to these rooms night after night, and I'm grateful for that. There's a reason you keep coming back. The stories kept inside these walls aren't quite like the ones you'll hear anywhere else. Before we begin, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. I always enjoy reading them. And if these stories stay with you, a like and a subscribe help more than you know. Now get comfortable, breathe slow, and let's open the door together.
A few years ago, somewhere around 3 or 4 winters back, Western New York got hit by one of the worst snowstorms I can remember. And honestly, unless somebody has actually lived through winters around that area, it is hard to fully explain how terrifying lake effect snow can become. People from other places imagine snow as inconvenient or maybe beautiful for a day or two. Western New York storms can feel almost apocalyptic. The snow does not just fall, it consumes everything. Roads vanish completely overnight. Cars disappear under white drifts, street signs become buried. Entire neighborhoods start looking unfamiliar because all the normal shapes of the world get swallowed beneath layers of snow. And during the worst storms, the silence becomes eerie too. Snow absorbs sound in this strange, unnatural way. Everything gets quieter while visibility gets worse, until the entire world feels small and isolated. This particular storm did not hit for one night and then move on either. It dragged on for weeks, actual weeks. Every time people thought things were calming down, another wave came through and dumped more snow everywhere. The piles along roads kept getting taller and taller until some snowbanks were literally higher than people. Parking lots became giant frozen landscapes filled with uneven white hills instead of cars. Normal life almost stopped completely for a while. Most businesses shut down because travel became dangerous or impossible. Schools closed. Small stores locked up. People stayed inside unless they absolutely had to leave. Only essential places remained open consistently. Hospitals, gas stations, certain grocery stores, a few fast food restaurants operating limited hours. Stuff people depended on when everything else froze. One of those places still operating was a McDonald's near where several of my old high school friends worked at the time. The employees hated going in during the storm, but because the restaurant technically stayed open, people still had to show up for shifts when they could. According to my friends, sometime near the beginning of the storm, they noticed a car parked near the very back edge of the lot. Nothing immediately strange about it. That is important. Nobody saw it and thought danger. During massive snowstorms, abandoned cars become normal. People slide off roads. Vehicles get stuck. Engines fail in freezing temperatures. Some drivers simply leave cars temporarily because conditions become too dangerous to continue. So one random unfamiliar car sitting in the back corner of a McDonald's parking lot barely registered to anybody. At first, employees joked about it casually, probably assumed somebody got stranded or planned to return later. But the weather kept getting worse, and the car never moved. That detail seems simple now, but at the time everybody's brains were focused on survival and routine. When extreme weather hits, people stop paying attention to things they would normally notice. You shovel snow, try not to crash driving, worry about power outages, check weather reports obsessively. A parked car does not feel important. Days passed, then more days. The storm kept dumping snow endlessly. Slowly the car started disappearing. And honestly, that image still unsettles me deeply when I think about it. A completely motionless vehicle gradually being swallowed by snow while people unknowingly walked past it every single day. At first the whole car remained visible, then only parts of it. Then eventually snowbanks built around it so heavily that it looked less like a parked vehicle and more like another frozen mound in the lot. My friends worked multiple shifts during those weeks and kept seeing it sitting there unchanged. No tire tracks, no movement, no signs anyone had checked on it. By that point, people started finding it weird. 3 weeks is a long time for a car to sit untouched in the same spot during a major storm without somebody eventually returning for it, especially in a busy commercial parking lot. Eventually, the manager decided somebody should probably contact police about it. From what I heard afterward, they initially assumed it was either abandoned or stolen. Maybe somebody ditched it during the storm. Maybe the owner got stranded elsewhere. Nobody expected what they were about to find. When officers checked the vehicle, they discovered a woman dead inside. She had apparently been there the entire time, all 3 weeks. That realization still makes my stomach drop every time I think about it, because suddenly every ordinary detail becomes horrifying in hindsight. Employees walked past the car constantly. Customers parked nearby. Snowplows maneuvered around it. People came and went every day while a dead woman sat alone inside that buried vehicle unnoticed. I honestly cannot imagine the feeling when police opened the car and realized someone had been there all along. According to what people later heard around town, the woman was from another state and had apparently died from natural causes or some kind of sudden medical emergency. I never learned every detail. Maybe she became stranded during the storm and suffered a health crisis. Maybe she was already sick. Maybe the freezing weather complicated everything. I honestly do not know. But what made the story especially heartbreaking was the idea that she was alone. There is something uniquely haunting about somebody dying quietly in an ordinary parking lot while the world keeps moving around them completely unaware. And because the storm was so severe, everything became delayed and distorted. Tow truck services were overwhelmed. Road conditions were terrible. Businesses operated with skeleton crews. Normal routines broke down completely. Under ordinary circumstances, somebody probably would have checked the vehicle much sooner. But during those weeks, survival itself became the main priority for everybody. That is one of the scariest things about extreme weather, honestly. It isolates people in ways we rarely think about. It narrows human attention. During disasters, people stop noticing certain things because all their energy goes toward immediate survival and problem solving. And sometimes that means tragedies remain hidden in plain sight. What really stayed with me, though, was imagining her family during those weeks. Somewhere out there, people were probably desperately trying to contact her, calling her phone repeatedly, leaving voicemails, wondering why she was not answering, maybe assuming weather delays explained everything, maybe hoping she found somewhere warm to wait out the storm, all while she sat alone inside a snow-covered car in the corner of a fast food parking lot. That thought genuinely breaks my heart, because the whole situation feels so ordinary and tragic at the same time. No murderer, no monster, no dramatic violence. Just a human being quietly disappearing during weeks of chaos while everybody unknowingly walked past. I think that is why the story affected so many people around here after it became known. Everybody remembered those storms vividly. Everybody understood how bad visibility was. Everybody remembered parking lots filled with half-buried vehicles. And because of that, everybody could imagine how easy it would have been to overlook one silent car among countless others during that mess. The older I get, the more stories like this disturb me compared to traditional horror stories. Because real-life tragedy is often quiet, not dramatic, not cinematic. Just snow falling steadily night after night, while somebody's loved one sits alone unseen only a few feet away from ordinary life continuing around them. And honestly, there is something deeply haunting about imagining that snowfall continuing silently over the car for weeks, slowly covering more and more of it, while nobody yet realized the person inside was never going home again. When I was a teenager, my parents lived in a house that always felt slightly strange after dark. Not haunted exactly, at least not in the dramatic horror movie sense, but it had one of those atmospheres that made ordinary noises feel unsettling once the sun went down. Part of it was probably the layout of the house itself. Almost all the internal doors were French doors with glass panels in them, so no matter where you were, you could usually see into another room or down the hallway. During the daytime, it actually looked nice because the house felt open and bright. At night, though, it completely changed the feeling of the place. The glass reflected light strangely. Dark rooms always seemed partially visible, and the hallway somehow looked longer once the rest of the house got quiet. Our staircase sat near the center of the house, leading down into the main hallway. From certain rooms, you could see directly toward the bottom of the stairs through the glass doors. That detail becomes important later. At the time, I was obsessed with horror movies. I watched them constantly. Ghost stories, paranormal shows, anything creepy I could find. So when weird things started happening, I immediately blamed my own imagination rather than taking them seriously. The first time I saw her, I honestly barely processed it. I was upstairs late one evening, walking past one of the glass doors when I caught movement near the bottom of the staircase. It looked like a little girl standing there. Not clearly enough for me to describe every feature, but enough to instantly recognize the shape of a child. She seemed small, still, almost like she was watching upward toward the stairs. Then within a second, she darted sideways across the hallway and disappeared into the front room. I remember freezing immediately. At first I thought maybe one of my younger relatives had somehow come over unexpectedly, or something equally normal. But the front room was empty, completely empty. No footsteps, no movement, nothing. The entire thing happened so fast that I convinced myself I must have imagined it. And honestly, horror movies were the perfect explanation. When you spend enough nights filling your brain with creepy imagery, your mind starts turning shadows into people automatically. So I brushed it off, or at least I tried to. Then it happened again. A few days later, late at night, I caught the exact same glimpse from upstairs. The little girl standing near the bottom of the stairs, still, silent. Then suddenly running across the hallway before vanishing into the front room. Again, when I checked, nobody was there. This time the fear hit me harder because the movement looked so specific and real. Not like random shadows, not like a trick of light, an actual child moving quickly across the hallway. But even then, I still refused to tell anyone, partly because I did not want to sound ridiculous, and partly because I genuinely believed my brain was probably creating the image itself. I told myself the same thing over and over. You've been watching too many horror movies. You're tired. You're imagining things. That explanation felt safer than any alternative. Over the next couple of weeks, I kept occasionally seeing her, always the same way, never upstairs, never close to me directly, always near the bottom of the stairs or crossing the hallway, and always gone within seconds. I started dreading looking through those glass doors at night because part of me became terrified I would see her again. What unsettled me most was how ordinary she looked. Not some terrifying monster, just a little girl. That somehow made it worse. There is something deeply unnerving about seeing something that appears completely human, where no human should actually be. And every single time I saw her, I got the exact same physical reaction, instant cold panic. Like my body recognized something was wrong before my brain caught up. Still, I kept it completely to myself. I never told my parents, never told my sister, never even hinted at it. I honestly thought if I said it out loud, everyone would assume I had scared myself stupid with horror movies. Then one afternoon, everything changed. I was sitting at the kitchen table eating lunch with my mom and sister. Completely normal day, bright sunlight outside, nothing remotely creepy happening. We were just casually talking about random things when suddenly my sister mentioned something strange. At first her tone sounded hesitant, almost embarrassed. Then she asked my mom if she had ever seen anything weird in the house. I remember immediately paying attention because something in her voice sounded serious. My mom laughed it off at first and asked what she meant. Then my sister described seeing a little girl standing at the bottom of the stairs. The second those words left her mouth, I felt my entire body go cold. Not nervous, not startled, because she started describing exactly what I had been seeing. Same location, same hallway, same little girl, same movement across the front room. I just sat there staring at her while she talked because suddenly all my explanations collapsed instantly. Up until that moment, I could tell myself it was imagination, stress, horror movies, shadows. But I had never told anyone. There was absolutely no reason my sister should have described the exact same thing independently. And honestly, I think seeing my reaction scared her too, because when she finished talking, I immediately interrupted and asked her to repeat everything carefully. Then I told them I had seen the exact same thing multiple times. I still remember the silence afterward. My mom looked uncomfortable immediately, probably trying to think of rational explanations. But both my sister and I knew the same horrifying fact. Neither of us had planted the idea in the other person's head. We had both kept it secret, and somehow we described the same figure. That was the moment the entire thing became truly frightening to me. Not when I first saw her, when somebody else confirmed it. Because once another person independently sees the same thing, your brain loses its safest explanation. From that point onward, Every nighttime noise in the house started feeling different. Every glance through the glass doors became tense. Even during the daytime, the hallway somehow felt wrong. My sister became just as freaked out as I was. We kept asking each other questions afterward, trying to find differences in what we saw, almost hoping one of us remembered it differently enough to prove it was coincidence. But the descriptions matched too closely. A little girl, bottom of the stairs, crossing the hallway, disappearing into the front room, gone instantly afterward. Eventually, my family decided to have prayers done in the house. Nothing dramatic like in movies, just family prayers and blessings meant to bring comfort and peace to the home. And strangely enough, after that, neither my sister nor I ever saw the girl again. Not once. No movement in the hallway. No glimpses at the bottom of the stairs. Nothing. The entire thing simply stopped. Now obviously there are rational explanations people could suggest. Shared suggestion. Misinterpreted shadows. Childhood imagination. Memory influencing memory afterward. I completely understand all of that. And honestly, part of me still tries to believe one of those explanations. But what continues to bother me years later is the timing of that lunch conversation. Because before my sister spoke that day, I had truly convinced myself I was imagining things. Then suddenly another person described the exact same image I had kept secret for weeks. That moment is what stayed with me. That awful cold feeling realizing maybe I had not been alone in seeing it after all. And honestly, I think that is why the experience still unsettles me more than most horror movies ever could. Not because I know for certain it was something supernatural, but because I still cannot fully explain how two people quietly carried the exact same fear inside the same house without ever speaking about it until one random afternoon at lunch. This happened when my friend and I were around 21 or 22 years old. Back when we still thought being young automatically made us invincible. Looking back now, I honestly think we came dangerously close to disappearing that night. At the time though, we were just two drunk girls trying to get home after bar hopping. It was one of those long, messy nights where you start at one bar, then somebody suggests another place, then another, and suddenly it is closing time and your feet hurt, your makeup is ruined, and your judgment is nowhere near as sharp as you think it is. We had both been drinking heavily. Not blackout drunk, but definitely drunk enough that our decision-making was compromised. The bars closed and everybody started flooding out into the streets at once. Loud crowds everywhere, music still echoing from inside buildings, people yelling for friends, couples arguing, drunk strangers laughing way too hard at nothing. Outside, there were several taxis lined up waiting for people, or at least what we thought were taxis. One guy leaned out his passenger side window and shouted toward us asking if we needed a ride. That alone probably should have made us hesitate more than it did. But when you are young and intoxicated, your brain often prioritizes convenience over caution. We just wanted to get home, so we got in his van. Even writing that sentence now makes me cringe. The second thing that should have alarmed us happened immediately afterward. The driver insisted that one of us sit in the front passenger seat while the others sat in the back. At the time, it felt slightly odd to me. Not terrifying, just strange enough that I noticed it. But again, drunk brain logic kicked in. I remember literally thinking I was probably overreacting. People ignore their instincts all the time because they are afraid of seeming rude or paranoid. So I climbed into the front passenger seat while my friend sat in the back. It was just the three of us in the van. And almost immediately, something about him started feeling wrong. Not one huge obvious thing, just little details. The way he stared too long, the way he smiled without warmth, the way his questions became personal too quickly. At first though, nothing openly dangerous happened. Then he suddenly pulled over near another bar. Three guys came running up to the driver's side window. I remember watching them exchange money quickly through the window while the driver handed them a tiny plastic bag. At the exact moment it happened, my drunk brain did not fully process what I was looking at. But after we started driving again, realization slowly hit me. I had just watched a drug deal happen inches away from me. Not subtle either. Just completely casually, like this guy did it constantly. Suddenly, every uneasy feeling I had started getting stronger. Then he started asking questions. Questions about my apartment. Questions about whether I had roommates. Questions about neighbors. Questions about whether anyone else would be awake when we got home. And the more he asked, the colder my stomach felt. At that point, I stopped thinking of him as weird and started thinking of him as dangerous. I leaned slightly toward the back seat and whispered quietly to my friend that we absolutely could not let this man know which apartment was mine. Thankfully, we had only given him the address of the apartment complex itself, not the specific unit. I remember my friend's expression changing immediately because she felt it too. That same instinctive fear. We both suddenly understood the same thing without fully saying it out loud. Something was very wrong, so we came up with a quick excuse. We told him to stop at a Walmart near my apartment because we needed to grab something before going home. I honestly cannot even remember what excuse we gave specifically. Probably something stupid and rushed. The important thing was just getting out of the van. But when we got there, the situation became even creepier. He would not let us go into the store alone. That detail still gives me chills. A normal driver would have waited in the parking lot. Instead, he insisted on coming inside with us. And not casually either. He stayed physically close to my friend the entire time. At one point, he was actually holding on to her arm while they walked. That was the moment pure panic finally replaced all uncertainty in my mind. Because now it no longer felt like awkward paranoia. It felt predatory. My friend quietly told me to go ahead and get whatever excuse item and cash we supposedly needed while she stayed with him for the moment. I still remember the look she gave me. We both knew what we were really doing, buying time. The second I got out of sight, I pulled out my phone and called 911. I spoke as quietly and quickly as possible, while practically speed-walking through the store. I told the dispatcher everything, that we had gotten into a fake taxi, that the driver had done a drug deal, that he was refusing to leave us alone, that I thought my friend and I were in danger. Then adrenaline completely took over. I kicked off my high heels because I realized instantly I would never be able to run or fight properly wearing them. And honestly, what I did next sounds insane now, but at the time my brain had switched fully into survival mode. I ran straight toward the hardware section. I grabbed the biggest hammer I could comfortably swing. I remember thinking one very clear thought. I am not letting this man take my friend. That was it. No complicated strategy, no fear about consequences. Just absolute certainty that if things escalated, I was going to fight. I sprinted back toward the front of the store carrying the hammer while still on the phone with 911. At some point during all of this, my fear disappeared completely and turned into aggression instead. Not recklessness, protectiveness. I think there is a point in some dangerous situations where your brain stops imagining worst-case scenarios and simply commits to action. As I came around the corner near the entrance, my friend saw me first, and somehow she immediately understood. The second she noticed me running toward them, she started struggling to pull away from him. At first he tried tightening his grip on her arm. Then she yanked herself loose and started running toward me. Meanwhile, I kept moving straight toward him with the hammer in my hands. I honestly believe if the police had not arrived when they did, I probably would have swung it. I was maybe 5 feet away from him at that point. He finally seemed to realize the situation was collapsing around him. He turned and started trying to run back toward his van. And then, almost perfectly timed like something from a movie, 4 huge Warren police officers came rushing into the parking lot. I still remember the relief hitting me so hard my legs almost gave out. The officers caught him immediately before he could get back into the van. Afterward, everything became kind of blurry in that strange post-adrenaline way. The cops separated us, asked questions, took statements. At one point, they even joked a little about my hammer once they realized we were safe. I think they were trying to calm us down because by then both my friend and I were shaking hard from delayed panic. Eventually, they drove us home themselves. And that is when we learned the final terrifying detail. The man was not actually a taxi driver at all. Not licensed, not legitimate. Just some random creep pretending to pick up drunk women outside bars. That realization honestly horrifies me more the older I get. Because if we had been slightly more intoxicated, slightly less alert, slightly slower to trust our instincts, he would have known exactly where I lived. And I truly believe something terrible would have happened. To this day, my friend and I both agree on that completely. We may never know exactly what his intentions were, but every instinct we had that night screamed danger for a reason. And honestly, I still think about how thin the line was between safety and disaster. One Walmart stop, one phone call, a few minutes of quick thinking. That was all that separated us from whatever might have happened if he had gotten us alone at my apartment complex. People laugh sometimes about women trusting their gut instincts too much. But that night taught me something important. Fear exists for a reason, and sometimes listening to it is exactly what keeps you alive. A few years ago, I spent about 6 months working with a charity organization in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Technically, my role was not even humanitarian in the dramatic sense people usually imagine when they hear stories like this. I was not rescuing people from danger or delivering emotional speeches or anything like that. Honestly, most of my job was boring paperwork, budgets, receipts, financial oversight, making sure money was being spent where it was supposed to go. But part of the work involved visiting different local charities and organizations that received funding support. And whenever outsiders arrived, especially foreigners connected to funding, people tended to perform suffering in a very particular way. That sounds cruel to say, but I do not know how else to describe it. Every visit became a presentation. Not fake exactly. The suffering was real. That was the worst part. But it was packaged and displayed carefully because everybody understood that attention, sympathy, and funding were connected together. So whenever we visited orphanages, shelters, clinics, or homes, there was always this uncomfortable atmosphere where people seemed desperate to prove how tragic their situation was. As if they were constantly afraid somebody would decide they were not worthy enough of help. And honestly, I think that environment damages people in ways outsiders rarely think about. Because eventually trauma itself becomes something people feel forced to display repeatedly for survival. One of the places we visited was a boys' home in Kisangani. Even now, years later, that place still sits heavily in my memory. Kisangani already felt emotionally exhausting before we even arrived at the home itself. The city carried this strange tension underneath ordinary life. Kids played in the streets. Markets operated normally. People laughed and talked like anywhere else. But the history of violence never felt far away. Civil wars there devastated entire generations. And even when active fighting slowed, the psychological damage remained everywhere. You could feel it in conversations sometimes. People mentioned atrocities almost casually because horrific violence had become normalized through repetition. When we arrived at the boys' home, the director immediately went into what I privately started thinking of as presentation mode. Big smiles, long speeches about the charity's work, stories about helping vulnerable children, the same routine I had seen at other places. Again, none of it was fake exactly. The organization really was helping people. But there was always this uncomfortable pressure underneath everything, like human suffering was being organized into a pitch deck. At some point during the visit, the director told us he wanted 2 of the boys to share their story with me. I remember feeling uncomfortable immediately, not because I lacked sympathy, because I knew I was the wrong audience. I was not there making decisions about major funding or media exposure. I was basically reviewing financial accountability. There was absolutely no practical reason these boys needed to relive their trauma in front of me. But refusing would have created awkwardness, so I stayed quiet. Then they brought the 2 young men out. They were brothers, late teens probably, maybe older. Honestly, it was hard to tell because trauma ages people strangely. What struck me immediately was their expressions, or more accurately, the lack of expression. They looked emotionally exhausted in a way I still struggle to describe properly. Not crying, not angry, not visibly broken in an obvious dramatic way, just emptied out. Like whatever part of them once expected kindness from the world had died a long time earlier. The director introduced them and explained they had survived violence during one of the Civil War flare-ups years earlier. Then the brothers started telling their story, and the way they told it honestly disturbed me almost as much as the story itself. Their voices were flat, monotone, not emotionless exactly, but drained. Like they had repeated the story so many times that it no longer fully belonged to them anymore. Like they were reciting history rather than remembering their own lives. According to them, when they were children, militiamen broke into their apartment building during fighting. The father was murdered immediately. The mother was dragged away. Later they learned she had been raped and killed. That alone would already have been enough horror for several lifetimes, but it got worse. The soldiers then turned their attention toward the boys. They tried forcing the older brother to sexually assault the younger one. He was under 10 years old at the time, a child, and because he physically could not comply, the men became enraged. One of the brothers explained that they beat his genitals with a switch until they were severely damaged and bleeding. I remember standing there feeling almost detached from my own body while listening because the sheer cruelty became difficult to process mentally. There are moments where human violence stops feeling understandable even in the broadest sense. This was one of those moments. Then they described the soldiers firing their guns and using the hot barrels to assault both boys. Even now, years later, writing those words feels unreal. Not because I doubt it happened. Because part of the human brain resists fully accepting that people can deliberately inflict that level of suffering on children. But the brothers described it calmly, quietly, like men discussing weather they survived years ago. And honestly, that calmness is what destroyed me emotionally more than anything else. If they had cried, screamed, broken down, maybe my brain could have processed it differently. Instead, they spoke with this horrible, exhausted softness that made everything feel inevitable somehow. Like they no longer believed the world contained justice or shock or outrage, just suffering, endless suffering. When they finished telling the story, there was a pause. I remember not knowing what to say. What can you possibly say after hearing something like that? There are no comforting words large enough. Then the director stepped in again. And this is the part that honestly haunted me nearly as much as the story itself. In this strange, almost salesman-like tone, he added that both young men still had to wear diapers because of the damage done to their bodies. He said it the way somebody might mention an extra tragic detail in a fundraising commercial. Meanwhile, the two brothers stood there with their eyes lowered toward the floor, humiliated, silent, completely passive. And suddenly the entire situation became unbearable to me. Because these were not just victims of unimaginable violence anymore. They were also trapped inside a system where their worst trauma had become something repeatedly displayed for outsiders. That realization hit me hard, not because the charity was evil exactly. I genuinely believed they were trying to help. But there was something deeply disturbing about the way unimaginable suffering had become institutionalized into storytelling, as though survival itself required reopening wounds over and over for visitors. And the worst part was the helplessness. I could not fix anything. I was not some powerful donor capable of transforming their lives overnight. I was a random foreign worker reviewing paperwork, while two young men described atrocities they experienced as children. That disconnect made me feel sick, because after hearing something that horrific, every ordinary interaction afterward felt absurd. You nod politely, thank people for their time, continue discussing receipts and funding reports, then eventually get back in a vehicle and leave. Meanwhile, those two men remain there, carrying memories most people could not survive psychologically. I think about their voices sometimes even now, that flat, exhausted monotone, not dramatic, not theatrical, just tired. There is something uniquely haunting about people who no longer expect the world to react to their pain, as if suffering has become so constant that describing it feels no different than describing daily routine. The older I get, the more I think that was the true horror of the experience. Not only the violence itself, horrific as it was, but the feeling that the violence had become normalized afterward, processed, packaged, repeated, retold until even the victims themselves sounded emotionally detached from it. And honestly, I still do not fully know how to process the memory. Part of me feels guilty for even remembering it because I was only a witness for a few minutes, while they had to live with it forever. But another part of me knows forgetting would feel wrong too, because those boys stood there and told the truth about what happened to them in a voice so empty and resigned that it permanently changed the way I understand trauma. Not all suffering screams. Sometimes it speaks quietly with its eyes fixed on the floor, as if it already knows nothing in the world can undo what happened anyway. When I was around 10 or 11 years old, my parents and I went to visit some family friends one evening, along with another family we knew. It was one of those long social visits adults enjoy where everybody sits around drinking tea or coffee, talking endlessly, while the kids slowly get bored out of their minds. I remember it being cold outside that night. Not snowing or anything dramatic, but cold enough that your hands instinctively disappear into your pockets the second you step outdoors. Eventually, it was time for everyone to leave. Or at least it was supposed to be. Anybody with parents like mine probably understands this situation immediately. Adults say they are leaving, everybody puts on jackets, says goodbye near the door, and then somehow another entire conversation starts and lasts another 20 minutes. That was exactly what happened. The adults stood outside, still talking, while I waited nearby, getting more and more impatient. At that age, I already considered myself pretty independent. My parents trusted me a lot, too. I walked places alone, stayed outside unsupervised, handled small responsibilities myself. So being alone for a few minutes was completely normal to me. Eventually, I got tired of waiting and asked my dad for the car keys. I figured I would just go sit in the car until the adults finally finished talking. He handed me the keys and pointed me toward where the car was parked. Normally, we parked in one specific area whenever we visited that house. But this time, he told me the car was farther away than usual. He pointed downhill toward a parking area around a corner and said the car was there. So off I went. At first, nothing felt strange at all. I shoved my hands into my pockets because of the cold and started walking downhill. The area was quiet in that eerie nighttime suburban way where everything feels slightly too still. The streetlights were dim, and because the parking area curved around a corner, I quickly moved out of sight from the house. That part matters. Once I turned the corner, nobody could really see me anymore. But at the time, that did not concern me. I was used to being alone. Then I saw him. Even now, years later, I still remember the feeling more clearly than I remember the man himself. I looked up while walking and noticed a man farther down the sidewalk. Nothing obviously threatening about him at first glance. He was just there. But the second I saw him, something inside me reacted immediately. People talk a lot about gut feelings, and before that night I never fully understood what they meant. But this was not normal nervousness. It felt physical, like my entire body suddenly wanted to escape. My stomach tightened instantly. Every instinct in me screamed that something was wrong before my brain could even explain why. I remember thinking afterward that it honestly felt like my body was trying to flee before my mind caught up. Normally, I was not the kind of person who looked back at strangers after passing them. If somebody walked by, I just kept moving. But this time, something forced me to turn around. And honestly, I think that decision may have saved me. When I looked back the first time, the man kept walking normally. He did not acknowledge me, did not stare, did not speak. He simply continued down the street like I did not exist. And strangely, while I kept my eyes on him, my panic eased slightly. Not completely, but enough that I almost convinced myself I was imagining things. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe he was just some random guy walking home. So I turned forward again and kept walking. The second I stopped watching him, that horrible feeling came rushing back stronger than before. My instincts practically screamed at me to look again, so I did, and that is when everything changed. The man had turned around completely. Not casually either. He was now walking directly toward me. I still remember how fast the fear hit me in that moment. It felt like ice water dropping through my entire body, because suddenly my instincts no longer felt irrational. Something really was wrong. I immediately turned forward and started walking faster. Not running yet, just faster, trying to act normal while every nerve in my body panicked. Then I glanced back again. Maybe it was my imagination, maybe not. But it looked like he sped up too. That was enough for me. I started running. The strange thing is that externally I panicked hard, but internally my brain became weirdly focused. It felt like survival mode activated instantly. I was not thinking emotionally anymore. I was thinking strategically. The sidewalk curved in a way that created a small blind spot ahead, and suddenly an idea popped into my head. Instead of simply running away in a straight line, I decided to try something else. It is hard to explain clearly without physically showing it, but basically my thought process was this. If I disappeared around the corner quickly enough, maybe I could loop behind him instead. At that age, I was small and fast, and I knew the layout better than he did because we visited the area before, so I sprinted toward the curve. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I remember my shoes slamming against the pavement and the freezing air burning in my throat while I ran. The second I hit the corner, I cut sharply out of sight instead of continuing straight. For one terrifying moment, everything went silent. No footsteps, no voice, nothing. I flattened myself near the wall and listened. Then I heard footsteps approaching fast. He had definitely followed me. That realization still gives me chills, because at that point there was no more pretending it was coincidence. A grown man had changed direction and accelerated toward a child alone at night. I waited only a second before moving again. Instead of staying hidden, I darted back the opposite direction, essentially trying to put him in front of me rather than behind me. It actually worked for a moment. When he rounded the corner, expecting me to continue downhill, I slipped behind him and sprinted uphill back toward the house as fast as I possibly could. I remember looking back briefly while running and seeing him stop suddenly, almost confused. Then he turned again and started after me. That image stayed burned into my memory for years. A grown man turning and pursuing a terrified kid running uphill in the dark. At that point, I stopped thinking strategically and just ran with everything I had. I could finally see the lights near the house again. I could hear the adults talking faintly, and I think the man realized it too, because the closer I got to the group, the slower he became. By the time I reached the area where my parents and the other adults were standing, he had completely stopped following me. I turned around breathing hard, trying not to look completely hysterical, and he was gone, just gone. Either he walked away quickly or ducked off somewhere out of sight. I remember my parents immediately noticing something was wrong because I looked terrified. At first I struggled to explain it because honestly, at that age, it felt hard to justify my fear logically. Technically, nothing had happened. The man never touched me, never spoke to me, never threatened me. But deep down I knew with absolute certainty that if I had ignored my instincts and kept walking normally down that isolated hill, something bad would have happened. The older I get, the more that experience unsettles me, because as a child I thought danger looked obvious. I thought predators would announce themselves somehow, but real danger often feels strangely quiet at first. Sometimes it is just a tiny shift in somebody's behavior, a turn, a change in pace, a feeling in your stomach that screams before your brain understands why. And honestly, I think that night permanently changed how much I trust instinct. People love telling kids not to overreact or not to judge strangers unfairly, but sometimes your body notices danger before your conscious mind can explain it. Mine definitely did that night. And to this day, I still wonder what that man would have done if I had kept walking downhill alone into that empty parking area where nobody could see or hear me. My dad told me a story again recently that I had completely forgotten about, and honestly I wish I still could forget it, because the more I think about it, the more horrifying it becomes. What makes it so disturbing is not just that people died. It is that the person responsible was somebody patients trusted completely, a doctor. The kind of person families look at with relief when they walk into a hospital room. The kind of person people believe is there to save lives. My dad was a general surgeon for most of his career before eventually retiring. Back in the 1960s, early in his medical career, he worked closely with another surgeon at a hospital. At the time, they were partners professionally, which meant they often covered each other's patients when one of them was unavailable. According to my dad, this doctor was respected. That is the first thing that always gets me about stories like this. Dangerous people are rarely obvious in real life. If this man had seemed openly unstable or cruel, nobody would have trusted him with patients in the first place. Apparently, he was intelligent, calm, professional, and successful enough that hospitals continued trusting him for years. At some point during the 1960s, the doctor went on vacation and asked my dad to keep an eye on one of his recovering surgical patients while he was gone. Nothing unusual about that. Doctors covered for each other constantly, so my dad agreed. The patient had recently undergone surgery and was supposed to be recovering normally according to the medical notes left behind by his partner. But almost immediately, something felt wrong to my dad. When he examined the patient during rounds, the man simply was not recovering the way he should have been. My dad had enough experience already to recognize when somebody's condition did not match the expected outcome after surgery. He said the patient looked worse than the notes suggested. Not dramatically dying at that moment, but wrong enough to trigger concern. So my dad started reviewing the chart more carefully. That is when he noticed something strange. Parts of the notes did not make sense. One detail he specifically remembered was that the chart referenced melanoma, but when my dad examined the patient, It was obvious the man did not have melanoma. At first, it probably seemed confusing more than alarming. Medical charts can become messy. Pages get misplaced sometimes. Doctors dictate notes quickly. Clerical mistakes happen. But as my dad kept reading, the inconsistencies became harder to ignore. Certain information clearly belonged to a completely different patient. It looked as though portions of another person's medical file had somehow been inserted into this patient's records. That alone was already deeply concerning. In medicine, mistakes in documentation can literally kill people. A wrong allergy, a wrong medication, a wrong diagnosis, any of those errors can become fatal. But according to my dad, something about this situation felt more deliberate than accidental. After finishing his rounds, he went home and discussed it with my mother, who was also a physician. She was a pediatric anesthesiologist, which meant she had extensive experience in surgery and critical care herself. Apparently, after hearing the details, she immediately felt uneasy too. She told him the chart situation was extremely abnormal. Either somebody had been unbelievably careless, or the records had been altered intentionally. And because the patient was failing to recover properly after surgery, she strongly encouraged my dad to operate again and see what was actually happening inside. Think about how serious that is for a moment. Performing another surgery is not a small decision. Every operation carries risks. Doctors do not simply reopen patients casually. But my parents both felt something dangerous was being missed. So the next day, my dad took the patient back into surgery. And once he opened him up, he realized something had gone very wrong during the original procedure. My dad never described every technical detail to me because, honestly, a lot of it was beyond my understanding anyway. But he said it became clear that his partner had done something during surgery that should never have happened. Not a tiny harmless mistake. Something major enough that the patient likely would have died without intervention. My dad corrected the problem during the operation and most likely saved the man's life. Now imagine what that realization must have felt like afterward. At first, my dad probably hoped maybe his partner had simply made a terrible mistake. Doctors are human beings after all. Surgery is complicated and exhausting. Errors happen even among skilled professionals. But my mother apparently did not believe that explanation. She told my dad he needed to distance himself from this man immediately. Not eventually, immediately. She believed something was seriously wrong. And honestly, the more I think about it, the more terrifying her instinct feels in hindsight, because she recognized danger before anybody else officially did. My dad ended the partnership and reported the situation to the head of the hospital, and nothing happened. That part always infuriates me. Nothing. No massive investigation, no emergency review, no dramatic intervention. The doctor continued practicing medicine. Patients continued trusting him. Families continued placing loved ones in his care. And according to what eventually came out years later, some of those people never walked back out of the hospital alive. About 10 years after my dad separated from him, the doctor was finally brought to trial for multiple homicides. By then, horrifying allegations had started surfacing. Investigators believed he had intentionally murdered some of his patients and manipulated circumstances to make the deaths appear natural or blameworthy on other physicians. According to my dad, one of the doctor's preferred methods involved cura. That detail alone is nightmare fuel. Curare was used in anesthesia decades ago as a muscle relaxant during surgery. Under controlled medical circumstances, patients receiving it would also be unconscious, intubated, and carefully monitored by anesthesiologists. But curare itself does not make somebody unconscious. That is the horrifying part. It paralyzes the muscles, including the muscles needed to breathe. Meaning if somebody were given a large enough dose without proper anesthesia or ventilation, they would remain mentally aware while becoming completely unable to move or breathe. Imagine that. You cannot scream, cannot move, cannot signal for help, cannot even force your lungs to inhale. You simply suffocate while trapped fully conscious inside your own body. Honestly, that may be one of the most terrifying ways to die I have ever heard described. And according to the accusations, this doctor used it to kill patients. My dad said investigators eventually suspected him in the deaths of around 22 people. 22. Not hardened criminals, not people involved in dangerous situations, patients. People who entered hospitals expecting treatment. Some were likely already scared and vulnerable before surgery even began. One of the deaths especially haunted me after my dad mentioned it. A 6-year-old girl had reportedly gone to the hospital with acute appendicitis. That should have been survivable. A frightening situation for parents, yes, but something hospitals handle constantly. Instead, she died. And hearing that detail hit me differently, because I have a 6-year-old daughter myself now. The moment my dad said her age, my brain immediately pictured my own child lying in a hospital bed, trusting the adults around her to protect her. That thought honestly made me feel sick. There is something uniquely horrifying about the betrayal involved when a doctor intentionally harms patients. Hospitals are one of the few places where human beings surrender almost complete control over themselves. You let strangers inject medications into your body. You let them render you unconscious. You trust them completely because you have no choice. To imagine somebody abusing that trust deliberately is deeply disturbing. What makes the story even more frustrating is that despite everything, the doctor was found not guilty. According to my dad, the prosecution was handled poorly by an inexperienced attorney, while the defense lawyer was extremely skilled. The jury acquitted him. And almost immediately afterward, the doctor fled the country, just disappeared. That detail alone makes the entire story feel even darker somehow. Like somebody slipping away before consequences could fully catch up. Years later, a reporter from the New York Times investigated the case deeply enough to write a book about it called Somebody is Lying, the story of Dr. X. The reporter even interviewed my dad during the research process because of his involvement with the patient he likely saved decades earlier. And according to the reporter's conclusions, the real number of victims may truly have been around 22 people. That number haunts me. 22 families, 22 sets of parents, spouses, children, or siblings. And potentially all because warning signs were ignored early on. Honestly, one of the scariest parts of the story to me is how close my dad came to staying professionally connected to him. What if he had ignored his instincts? What if my mother had dismissed the chart inconsistencies as harmless mistakes? What if he never reopened that patient? One decision probably saved at least one life, and maybe changed my father's entire career trajectory forever. The older I get, the more terrifying real-life horror becomes compared to fictional horror. Ghosts are distant. Monsters are imaginary. But stories like this are real reminders that sometimes the most dangerous people in society are the ones wearing respected uniforms, speaking calmly, and standing exactly where trust is expected most. And honestly, I think that is what unsettles me most of all. The idea that somewhere in that hospital decades ago, frightened patients probably looked at that doctor with relief, believing he was there to save them, while some of them may already have been unknowingly alone with the person who would kill them. One of the most disturbing real-life stories I ever heard stayed with me for years, not because it involved ghosts, demons, or some mysterious creature hiding in the dark, but because every person involved truly believed they were doing the correct thing right up until somebody died. That is what makes the story feel so horrible. There is clear villain standing in the shadows twirling a mustache. No obvious monster, no supernatural curse, just fear, confusion, adrenaline, and a chain of decisions made in a matter of seconds that destroyed multiple lives forever. What scares me most about stories like this is how easy it is to imagine yourself inside them. The entire situation began in the middle of the night, inside an ordinary apartment. A young couple had gone to bed like any other night. From what I remember, it happened during those deep early morning hours when the entire world feels dead silent. Around that time, most people are sleeping heavily enough that waking up suddenly feels almost painful. Your brain is slow, your thoughts feel tangled. For a few seconds after waking, reality itself almost feels fake. I think everybody knows that strange feeling. You wake up suddenly from a deep sleep and cannot immediately understand where you are or what is happening. That was the state they were in when the noise started. At first, it probably sounded distant and confusing. A loud bang somewhere outside, maybe part of a dream, maybe somebody slamming a car door. Then it happened again. Harder, closer, the sound of wood splintering, the sound of force. The kind of noise that instantly triggers something primal in the human brain. Someone was coming through the front door. Imagine that moment for a second. Pitch black room, half asleep, heart suddenly pounding so hard you can feel it in your throat. You are not thinking rationally yet. You are reacting on pure instinct. Every survival mechanism in your body activates at once. The crashing continued. Not one hit, multiple violent impacts. The apartment door was being forced open. From the perspective of the couple inside, there was only one obvious explanation: intruders. Unknown people breaking into their home in the middle of the night. And honestly, if you place yourself mentally into that exact situation, it becomes terrifyingly understandable why panic took over so fast. Nobody calmly analyzes things during moments like that. Movies create this illusion that people stop and think clearly under pressure. But real fear is messy and immediate. Your body moves before your brain fully catches up. The man grabbed a gun. That single decision changed everything forever. Now obviously, the second firearms enter a situation, opinions split instantly. Some people believe nobody should ever react that way. Others believe protecting your home is natural. But regardless of where somebody stands politically, emotionally, you can still understand the fear behind the decision. Somebody was violently entering the apartment where he and his girlfriend were sleeping. To him, it probably felt like life or death already. Then the door came open, and armed men entered. What happened next unfolded in only seconds. He fired, then they fired back, and suddenly the apartment exploded into chaos. Not cinematic chaos, real chaos. People who have never heard gunfire indoors usually cannot fully imagine how horrifying it actually is. The sound is not just loud, it is physically overwhelming. It punches through your body. In enclosed spaces, it becomes disorienting and deafening at the same time. Everything turns into noise and confusion instantly. Echoes, smoke, shouting, screaming, flashes of light in darkness. Pure sensory overload. There is no calm thinking happening anymore, just survival. During the exchange of gunfire, his girlfriend was hit, badly. And honestly, that detail is the part that breaks my heart most. One moment they were asleep together like any normal couple at the end of a normal day. Maybe they brushed their teeth together before bed. Maybe they talked about work the next morning. Maybe they argued about something small and meaningless couples always argue about. Completely ordinary human moments. Then within seconds, their bedroom turned into a gunfight. According to the story, she ended up bleeding to death there. Just thinking about that transition feels horrifying. Going from asleep beside someone you love to suddenly realizing they are dying next to you while gunfire echoes around the room. But somehow the story becomes even more disturbing afterward. Because the men who entered the apartment were not burglars, they were police officers. That is the detail that transforms the story from tragic into genuinely terrifying. Imagine realizing that in the middle of the chaos. Imagine the confusion hitting all at once. From the man's perspective, armed strangers crashed through his door in the middle of the night. From the officer's perspective, they were carrying out official police business. Two completely different realities collided inside one apartment. And once bullets started flying, nobody got the chance to stop and correct the misunderstanding. That is what makes stories like this so deeply unsettling to me. There is no comfortable emotional distance from it. You can too easily imagine yourself in that bedroom. People always think they would immediately recognize police officers during a raid. But would you really? At 3 in the morning, half awake, in darkness, while your front door is exploding inward, while armed figures rush inside shouting. Your brain barely functions normally seconds after waking up suddenly. Add fear and adrenaline on top of that, and reality becomes chaos. Afterward, the man was arrested, and almost immediately, public opinion split into opposing sides. Some people argued he never should have fired under any circumstances. Others argued that almost anybody would react the same way if armed men burst into their apartment unexpectedly during the middle of the night. That debate alone became intense and emotional. But then another detail came out during the investigation that made the situation even worse. One of the officers had fired a round that traveled through the apartment and entered a neighboring unit, a completely separate apartment. That detail honestly terrifies me more every time I think about it, because it means somebody entirely uninvolved could have died too. Imagine being asleep in your own apartment with absolutely no connection to the situation happening next door. You are dreaming peacefully 1 second. Then suddenly bullets are ripping through your walls because violence erupted nearby. That is one thing people often forget about gunfire in apartments or crowded neighborhoods. Walls are not magical protection. Bullets do not stop caring about innocence once they leave the barrel. Once shooting starts, danger spreads outward instantly. Eventually, the officers involved were also investigated and indicted over aspects of the raid and the shots fired, especially the round that entered the neighboring apartment. By that point, the entire situation had become a complete nightmare from every possible angle. A woman dead. A man facing criminal charges after believing he was defending his home. Police under investigation. Neighbors endangered. Families shattered permanently. And all of it unfolding in less than a minute. That is what haunts me most about stories like this. Not mystery, not evil masterminds, not monsters hiding in the dark. Just how terrifyingly fast ordinary life can collapse once fear and confusion collide. The older I get, the more I realize real-life horror often comes from misunderstandings escalating too quickly to stop. People reacting instinctively. People believing they are in danger. People having incomplete information. Fear smashing into fear until somebody dies. That is what makes this story impossible for me to shake. Because nobody woke up that morning expecting their lives to end. They probably went through completely normal routines the night before. Maybe they watched television. Maybe they argued about chores. Maybe they laughed at something stupid online before falling asleep. Just regular human life. Then hours later, there was a dead woman in the apartment. Police tape outside the building, investigators everywhere, neighbors terrified, and families grieving forever. And the truly horrifying part is how random it all feels. There is no dramatic warning before tragedy arrives in stories like this. No eerie music. No obvious sign saying your life is about to split into a before and after. Sometimes everything changes all at once because a door crashes open in the middle of the night and terrified people react exactly the way terrified humans often do. Let me stop here for just a breath. Some of you found Hushrot Hollow by accident tonight. One wrong turn through the dark, and here you are. Stay. The bell at the top of this video keeps the path lit, so you'll always know your way back when the next story calls. And hitting subscribe, that's how this small corner of the night keeps breathing. All right, the silence is waiting. Let's go. When I was around 17, there was this creepy situation happening around my county that everybody seemed to know about. At first, it spread mostly through Facebook posts and screenshots people were sharing back and forth, but eventually, it became one of those stories that everybody at school, work, and restaurants was talking about. There was a man going around visiting restaurants late at night and bothering teenage girls. Not in a loud, dramatic way either. That was what made it unsettling. He was apparently approaching girls who were leaving work alone after closing shifts, especially hostesses and servers. He would wait outside restaurants, try to talk to them, follow them to their cars, ask personal questions, and make them uncomfortable enough that local parents and businesses started warning people about him. At some point, somebody managed to take a picture of him. The image spread around really fast online. I remember seeing it myself while scrolling through social media. Everybody was reposting it with warnings telling girls not to leave work alone at night. Looking back now, I honestly should have been more concerned than I was. But when you are 17, danger often feels distant until it happens directly in front of you. Part of me assumed people were exaggerating. The internet always blows things up. And honestly, working at a restaurant, you get used to weird customers constantly. Creepy comments, awkward flirting, strange behavior from drunk people, older men lingering too long around teenage staff. It becomes so normalized that your brain stops treating it as serious unless something truly extreme happens. Even my boyfriend at the time did not seem very worried about it. We both basically treated it like one of those local rumors that would disappear after a few days. Then the very next night happened. At the time, I worked as a hostess at a restaurant. And that evening I was closing the host stand with one of my friends. It was already late, around 9:30 at night, and the restaurant had that strange, quiet feeling places get near closing time. Most of the customers were gone. The lights seemed dimmer. Chairs were already being stacked in sections. You could hear dishes clattering loudly from the kitchen because the dining room had become so quiet. Closing shifts always felt weirdly vulnerable to me, especially as a teenage girl. During busy hours, restaurants feel safe because people are everywhere. Managers, cooks, servers, families eating dinner, constant noise and movement. But near closing time, everything changes. Suddenly, there are only a handful of employees left. Parking lots start emptying out. and you become more aware of how dark it is outside. My friend and I were standing at the host stand talking while finishing our side work when a man walked in. At first, nothing about him immediately triggered alarm bells for me. He looked older, maybe middle age, and he smiled as he approached us. He said he wanted to order food to go. Totally normal request. He was staring at us a little too intensely, but honestly, that happened often enough working customer service that I barely registered it at first. My friend and I politely told him where to go for takeout orders. He thanked us and walked over toward the to-go area. I remember both of us shrugging it off almost immediately afterward. Restaurants attract weird people constantly, especially at night. Drunk customers, lonely people who want attention, men who think teenage hostesses exist to flirt with them. You get used to brushing things off just to survive working there. While he was over at the takeout counter, I noticed him glancing over at us multiple times, always smiling. Not huge smiles, just this strange, overly friendly expression that felt slightly off. Still, neither of us thought much about it. Time passed. Eventually, he got his food and started heading toward the exit. As he walked out, he looked directly at us again, waved casually, and said something like, "You girls have a lovely night." Polite, friendly, completely normal sounding. Then he left. Honestly, if things had ended there, I probably would not even remember him now. But only a minute or two later, one of our younger coworkers suddenly came rushing up toward the host's stand from the takeout area. I still remember the expression on her face. She looked genuinely panicked, not uncomfortable, not annoyed, actually scared. At first, my friend and I thought maybe there had been some issue with the order, or maybe the guy had said something rude. Instead, she immediately asked us if we knew who that man was. We said no, then she told us that was him, the man from the photo, the guy everybody had been warning girls about online. Apparently, while he was ordering food, he had started questioning the younger girls working to-go orders, asking how old they were, trying to find out personal details, lingering around staring at them. And these were not adults, they were minors. The second she said it, my stomach dropped. Suddenly, every weird little thing about him replayed differently in my head. The staring, the smiling, the way he looked at us, the too friendly goodbye. Everything instantly felt wrong. My fellow hostess and I just stared at each other in complete silence for a second, because suddenly the situation became very real. We were about to close, which meant we were about to walk outside into a dark parking lot after the man had already seen us working there. That is the moment fear really hit me, not while he was standing there. Afterward, once I realized who he actually was. That is one thing I have noticed about scary situations in real life. Sometimes your brain does not process danger immediately. Sometimes the fear arrives afterward once all the pieces click together. The younger coworker kept explaining how uncomfortable he had made them feel at the to-go counter, how he kept asking questions and staring. Meanwhile, all I could think about was leaving the building. I suddenly became hyper-aware of how vulnerable we all were. Teenage girls, late at night, mostly empty parking lot. One creepy older man already known for harassing girls outside restaurants. And honestly, what scared me most was realizing how easily I could have ignored every warning sign, because he did not walk in acting aggressive. He did not threaten anyone. He smiled. He acted polite. That is what dangerous people often do. They test boundaries quietly first. I ended up texting my boyfriend immediately and telling him what happened. Thankfully, unlike earlier when we both brushed the warnings off, he took it seriously this time. He told me under absolutely no circumstances was I supposed to leave alone. He told all of us to stay inside together until rides arrived. And he specifically told me to wait inside the restaurant for him instead of walking to my car by myself. Looking back now, I am honestly grateful my coworkers were smarter, more alert than I was in that moment. Because if the younger girl from takeout had not recognized him, I probably would have walked outside alone without a second thought. That realization still unsettles me. People always imagine dangerous situations looking dramatic and obvious, but most of the time they do not. Sometimes danger looks like an older man smiling politely while ordering takeout. Sometimes it waves goodbye and tells you to have a lovely night. And honestly, I think that is why the experience stuck with me so strongly over the years. Nothing technically happened to me. He never touched me, never followed me, never threatened me directly. But for the first time in my life, I fully understood how quickly somebody can become a target without realizing it, especially young girls. When you are 17, You often think being polite is more important than trusting your instincts. You laugh off discomfort because you do not want to seem rude or dramatic. You assume adults around you are harmless unless they prove otherwise. That night changed that for me, because afterward I realized something terrifying. If nobody had recognized him, we would have had absolutely no idea we were standing there smiling politely at a man already known for targeting girls exactly like us. About 10 years ago, when I was 18, I worked at a small local grocery store in my hometown. It was one of those places everybody in town knew. The kind where the same customers came in every week, cashiers knew regulars by name, and gossip somehow traveled through the aisles faster than the shopping carts did. At 18, I was painfully shy. Not the cute kind of shy people joke about either. I mean genuinely awkward. I hated starting conversations, overthought every interaction, and could barely make eye contact with guys I found attractive. Most of the time at work, I kept my head down, stocked shelves, smiled politely at customers, and tried not to embarrass myself. There was one guy there, though, who completely threw me off every time I saw him. He worked different shifts than me sometimes, but we overlapped enough that I got used to seeing him around the store. I honestly cannot even remember what department he worked in anymore. What I do remember are his eyes. They were ridiculously blue, not normal blue either. The kind of bright, icy blue that immediately grabs your attention when somebody looks at you. It sounds dramatic, but I remember the first time he smiled at me while we were both in the back room and thinking he honestly looked like the kind of guy girls write about in romance novels. And unlike me, he was not shy at all. He would always come over and talk to me during slower shifts, sometimes while we were both stocking shelves, sometimes near the break room, sometimes while pretending to ask work-related questions that clearly were not important enough to actually need answers. Nothing serious ever happened between us, mostly just flirting, little comments, jokes, lingering eye contact, that kind of thing. But when you are 18 and inexperienced, even small interactions can feel huge in your head. I remember going home and replaying conversations with him afterward, wondering if he liked me, wondering if he might ask me out eventually, wondering if maybe I should be braver and flirt harder back. Looking back now, it is strange how little you can actually know about someone while still building an entire image of them in your head. Because at the time, all I really knew was this: he was handsome, confident, funny, and nice to me. That was enough for my brain to fill in the rest. After a while, though, life moved on. I ended up moving to the next town over and getting another job. Nothing dramatic happened between us before I left. No big confession, no date, no kiss. We just slowly disappeared from each other's lives the way coworkers often do. Every now and then I would think about him randomly, mostly in a harmless, nostalgic way, like wondering what would have happened if I had stayed in town longer. Then about 2 years later, I saw his face on the news. I still remember the exact feeling in my stomach when I realized who it was. At first, my brain honestly refused to connect the two versions of him together. The guy on television looked familiar, but wrong somehow. The same blue eyes, the same face, but now attached to a mugshot and a horrifying headline. He had attacked his pregnant girlfriend. Not only attacked her, strangled her. And the girlfriend turned out to be another girl who had worked at that same grocery store while I was there. I knew her too, not super closely, but enough to recognize her immediately. The story that came out afterward was awful. Apparently, he had been abusing her for a long time behind closed doors, beating her throughout their relationship while most people around them had no idea. She survived, thankfully, but hearing all of it felt surreal to me, because my strongest memory of him had been standing under fluorescent grocery store lights, while he smiled at me and joked around casually like the safest person in the world. That realization honestly disturbed me for years afterward. The idea that somebody can appear charming, attractive, funny, and completely normal while secretly being violent behind closed doors. At 18, I thought danger looked obvious. I thought bad men announced themselves somehow, but real life does not work like that. Sometimes dangerous people are charismatic. Sometimes they are the person everybody likes. Sometimes they have beautiful eyes and easy smiles, and know exactly how to make people feel comfortable around them. I remember sitting there after watching the news story and thinking about all the tiny ways life could have shifted differently. What if I had stayed at that job? What if we had actually started dating? What if I had been the one alone with him instead? It is a horrifying feeling realizing you narrowly missed becoming part of someone else's nightmare without ever knowing it at the time. That story alone would probably have stayed with me forever. But weirdly enough, it was not even the creepiest thing I experienced growing up. When I was around 8 or 9 years old, my cousin and I spent about 2 weeks visiting my grandfather and his wife out of state during summer vacation. My cousin was younger than me, probably around 6. My grandfather lived way out in the middle of nowhere. And I mean genuinely nowhere. No neighborhoods, no nearby stores, no streetlights. Just woods stretching endlessly around scattered houses connected by long, empty roads. During the daytime, it was peaceful and kind of beautiful in that quiet country way. At night, though, it felt different. The darkness out there was complete. Not city darkness where you still see lights glowing somewhere in the distance. Real darkness. The kind where looking out the window at night feels like staring into an endless black wall. My grandfather's brother-in-law lived next door with his wife. I do not even remember the man's name anymore, only that as kids we were used to seeing him around constantly. To us, he was just another older relative figure adults seemed comfortable with. One night, my cousin and I stayed up ridiculously late watching cartoons. Honestly, we probably stayed awake almost the entire night because we were excited to have freedom away from home. We sat in the living room wrapped in blankets eating junk food while the television glowed in the dark house. Everybody else had gone to bed hours earlier. At some point around 3 or 4 in the morning, while everything outside was completely silent, I suddenly heard gunshots. 4 of them, back to back, boom, 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 boom. The sound echoed through the woods so loudly that it instantly made my stomach tighten. I remember freezing and looking at my cousin, but surprisingly she barely reacted. She just shrugged casually and said something like, "Oh, that's just him shooting deer, probably." Out where my grandfather lived, hunting was normal. Guns were normal. Hearing shots in the distance was apparently not unusual to her. So eventually I relaxed too. I remember thinking it sounded creepy, but not necessarily alarming. Then about 20 minutes later there was a knock at the door. Even now that part gives me chills. My cousin and I went to open it because we assumed it was probably some relative or something harmless. It was the brother-in-law, the same man we assumed had been outside shooting. I do not remember anything specifically strange about him at first. That is the creepy part. He did not come in acting wild or frantic. He sat and talked to us for a little while like everything was completely normal. Imagine that. 2 little kids sitting in pajamas watching cartoons at 4 in the morning while a man who had just shot his wife sat calmly talking nearby. Of course, we did not know that yet. He eventually left again. And honestly, if events had ended there, I probably would barely remember that night at all. But around an hour later, there was another knock at the door. We assumed it was him again. Instead, when we opened the door, 2 police officers were standing there. Everything changed instantly. They asked for the adults in the house, and suddenly that strange, nervous energy adults get during emergencies filled the room. My grandfather woke up confused while the officers started talking to him quietly. My cousin and I could not hear everything clearly, but we knew immediately something bad had happened. Eventually, we learned the truth. The brother-in-law had shot his wife several times. Those gunshots we heard in the woods had not been deer hunting. They had been attempted murder. And somehow, after shooting her, he had calmly walked over to our house and sat talking to 2 children while she lay bleeding next door. That is the detail that still horrifies me most, not the violence itself, the calmness afterward. Apparently, while he was sitting with us, his wife had managed to crawl her way to a phone and call the police. I do not remember every detail because I was so young, but I am pretty sure she survived. Thank God for that. But even years later, the image of that night still feels deeply unsettling to me. The cartoons playing quietly in the background, the dark woods outside, the sound of gunshots echoing through the trees. Then the man calmly sitting in the living room like nothing had happened while 2 little kids talked to him completely unaware. That is what scares me most about real-life horror stories as an adult. Not ghosts, not monsters, not supernatural things. It is how ordinary evil can look while it is happening. People imagine violent criminals acting wild or obviously insane all the time. But sometimes they look completely normal immediately afterward. Sometimes they sit calmly in your living room. Sometimes they smile. Sometimes they make casual conversation while somebody nearby is fighting to survive. Both of these experiences taught me the same uncomfortable lesson in different ways. You really never know what another person is capable of. Not from their face, not from their charm, not from how normal they seem when you first meet them. And honestly, I think that realization is scarier than almost anything else. Years ago, my wife used to work with a woman she was friendly with for a while. They were never extremely close, but they knew each other well enough to talk regularly, share stories about their families, complain about work, that kind of thing. Over time, they drifted apart the way a lot of adult friendships do. One person changes jobs, somebody moves, life gets busy, and eventually years pass without much contact. Still, my wife always remembered her as a kind person. The woman had a daughter who was probably in her late teens or early 20s at the time all of this happened. From what I heard, she seemed like a pretty normal girl at first. Maybe a little rebellious, maybe searching for identity the way young people often are. But nothing that would make anybody think something truly terrible was coming. Then she started dating this guy. At first, the parents apparently tried to stay polite about him because they did not want to push their daughter away. A lot of parents walk that line carefully when their kids start bringing home people they dislike. If you attack too hard, sometimes the kid clings to the relationship even tighter just to prove independence. But the more time went on, the worse this guy seemed. He was apparently obsessed with extremist politics and neo-Nazi ideology. Not in the vague internet edgelord way where somebody says shocking things for attention either. From what I was told, he genuinely believed the stuff he was saying. He would rant constantly. Talk about race. Talk about who deserved to live in the country. Talk about conspiracies. Talk about violence almost casually. The daughter unfortunately started absorbing some of it too for a while, which honestly is not uncommon in controlling relationships. When somebody spends enough time around a manipulative person, especially when emotions are involved, their worldview can slowly start shifting without them even realizing it. The parents were horrified. Imagine watching your child slowly change because of somebody you already know is dangerous. Apparently, there were arguments constantly in the house about him. The parents begged her to leave him. Friends warned her too. At first, she defended him, claimed people misunderstood him, claimed he was actually really sweet once you got to know him, that kind of thing. But eventually, thankfully, something clicked for her. Maybe she finally saw how hateful he really was. Maybe he became controlling. Maybe she got scared. Whatever happened, she finally agreed with her parents and decided to break things off. Most people would assume that would be the end of the story. Unpleasant relationship ends. Everybody moves on. But some people do not handle rejection normally, especially people whose entire identities revolve around anger, control, and grievance. According to what my wife heard afterward, the guy contacted the daughter and asked if he could come over one last time to talk about the relationship. He supposedly wanted closure, wanted to discuss things calmly. And because they were decent people trying to handle things peacefully, the parents allowed it. That detail always bothers me the most. They probably believed they were doing the mature thing. They probably thought keeping things calm would prevent escalation. Maybe they thought if they treated him respectfully, he would leave peacefully and disappear from their lives forever. Instead, he came into their house and murdered both of them, just like that. From what I remember being told, he shot them both during the confrontation. Then after killing them, he turned the gun on himself, but he survived. That part feels almost unreal to me every time I think about it. Two innocent people dead because they tried to protect their daughter from somebody dangerous, while the man responsible lived. The daughter survived physically, but I honestly cannot imagine what kind of psychological damage something like that leaves behind. Imagine knowing the person you dated walked into your childhood home and murdered your parents. Imagine knowing they only died because they were trying to help you escape him. There are some tragedies so horrible that your brain almost refuses to fully process them. The murders alone would already be enough to haunt anybody connected to the story. But what happened afterward is the part that genuinely unsettled me personally. 2 days after the murders, my wife and I were asleep in our bedroom. It was late at night, one of those dead quiet hours where even tiny sounds feel strange because the whole house is still. Then suddenly the phone started ringing. Not a cell phone either. This was back when people still had house phones sitting beside the bed. The ring cut through the silence so sharply that it instantly woke both of us up. Half asleep, my wife reached over and looked at the caller ID. Then she froze. I remember her face changing immediately. She suddenly looked pale and fully awake at the same time. I asked who it was. She just stared at the phone for another second before quietly saying the acquaintance's name. The murdered woman. Her number was appearing on our caller ID. Even without the murders, that would already have been strange. They had not spoken in years. The odds of randomly getting a late-night call from her out of nowhere were already slim. But now she was dead. 2 days dead. And somehow her home number was calling our bedroom in the middle of the night. I still remember the feeling in the room during those few seconds. That strange, heavy silence where your brain tries to force logic onto something before fear fully settles in. My wife did not answer. Honestly, I do not blame her. She just let it ring while staring at it. Then eventually it stopped. No voicemail, no explanation, nothing. To this day, we still do not know who made the call. There are logical possibilities, of course. Police using the house phone while investigating. Family members inside the home calling numbers from an address book. Maybe the daughter trying to contact people her mother knew while overwhelmed and traumatized. There are plenty of normal explanations. But logic feels weaker at 2 in the morning, when the number of a murdered woman lights up your bedroom after years of silence. Part of me still wonders what would have happened if my wife had answered. Would there have been somebody speaking? Silence? Static? A detective asking questions? Or maybe just an accidental pocket dial from somebody inside the house? But there is another part of me that is almost glad we never found out. Sometimes mystery is less disturbing than certainty. The thing that stayed with me the longest, though, was not actually the phone call. It was the realization that evil does not always arrive in obvious ways. Parents spend years worrying about strangers. They teach kids not to talk to suspicious people, not to get into cars with strangers, not to trust creepy-looking men. But sometimes the real danger enters your home politely. Sometimes it sits at your dinner table. Sometimes your child loves it. That idea honestly unsettled me more deeply than the late-night phone call ever did. As a parent, you imagine protecting your family from outside threats. You lock doors, you install alarms, you teach caution. But what do you do when your child willingly brings someone dangerous into your lives because they cannot yet see what you see? That helplessness is terrifying. And honestly, the older I get, the less supernatural things scare me compared to ordinary human hatred. A ghost calling the house would almost feel easier to understand. What actually happened was far worse. A real human being became so consumed by ideology, rage, and entitlement that he decided 2 innocent people no longer deserved to live simply because they stood between him and control over their daughter. That is the part I still think about years later, not the phone ringing in the dark. The fact that somebody sat in their living room pretending to be part of their lives while carrying murder around quietly inside his head the entire time. When I was really young, around 3 years old, my family took a trip to Myrtle Beach. Most of my memories from that age are blurry and broken apart into random little flashes. But there are certain moments that stay burned into your brain no matter how old you get. This was one of them. The trip itself was supposed to be a happy one. My parents were excited because my little sister had just been born not long before, and they wanted some kind of family vacation. From what I was told later, money was tight back then, so this was not some luxury getaway. It was more like one of those rare trips families save up for because they need a break from normal life. I remember the ocean more than anything. When you are a little kid, the ocean feels enormous, endless, loud. Every wave feels stronger than it probably is. Everything smells like salt water and sunscreen, and there are people everywhere laughing, yelling, dragging coolers across the sand. Kids crying because sand got in their eyes. Seagulls flying around waiting to steal food. My parents were trying to keep track of both me and my sister while also enjoying themselves, which honestly sounds exhausting now that I think about it as an adult. At some point, we were all in the water together. I remember the waves knocking me around and being excited because I thought I was brave enough to go farther out than I probably should have. My parents were nearby, but not right beside me every second. That was when the guy appeared. I do not remember exactly what he looked like anymore. Memory gets weird after enough years pass. I just remember him seeming friendly at first, like a normal adult at the beach. Nothing immediately threatening about him. Then suddenly he grabbed me underwater. At first I thought it really was some kind of game. Adults roughhousing with kids in pools or at beaches was pretty common back then. People were less cautious about everything. But within seconds I realized something felt wrong. He was holding me down. Not for 1 second, not for 2. Long enough for panic to hit. I remember the feeling more than the visuals. Salt water burning my nose and throat. The confusion. The helplessness of being tiny while somebody much bigger controls your entire body. I could not understand why it was happening. When you are 3 years old, you do not process danger the same way adults do. You just know something feels terrifying. Eventually somebody pulled me up or he let go. I honestly do not know which. I came back up coughing and crying while everything around me suddenly felt loud again. My parents immediately freaked out. They started yelling at him, asking what the hell he thought he was doing. And according to my mom, his response was unbelievably casual. He claimed he was just playing. That was it, just playing. Like nearly drowning a random toddler was somehow normal behavior. The craziest part is that nothing really happened to him afterward. No police, no lifeguards dragging him away, no dramatic scene. People around them probably assumed it was some misunderstanding. That is one thing I have realized as I have gotten older. Predators and dangerous people often survive because they hide behind normalcy. They rely on situations looking confusing enough that nobody acts decisively. Apparently, my parents stayed extremely alert after that. They kept noticing him around the area over the next several days. Not constantly, but enough that it unsettled them. He always seemed nearby somehow, sometimes at the beach, sometimes walking around town. Then eventually they learned he was actually from Parkersburg, West Virginia, too, which was where we were from. Now realistically, maybe that was coincidence. Small towns create weird overlaps sometimes. People vacation in the same places. Families return to the same beaches every year. But imagine how unsettling that must have felt for my parents after what had happened. Especially because after we got home, they kept seeing him around occasionally at places we went to, including the local swimming pool where my sister and I would swim. Again, maybe coincidence. But once somebody is frightened, your child, coincidence stops feeling comforting. My mom definitely never forgot him, neither did I. The weirdest part is that despite everything, life continued normally for a while. My parents kept taking us swimming because they did not want fear controlling our lives. Kids move on faster than adults sometimes too. I still liked water, I still wanted to swim. But then something happened that ended the entire situation in the most humiliating way possible. One day my older cousin took my sister and me to the pool. She was older than us by several years, and honestly a little unstable at times. Not dangerous exactly, but unpredictable. The type of person who reacted emotionally first and thought later. We got to the pool, looked around, and immediately spotted him there again. I remember my stomach dropping. Even as a kid, I knew I did not want to be there near him. My sister and I told my cousin who he was and begged her to leave. Instead of leaving, she got furious. Not quiet anger either, explosive anger. Before we could stop her, she marched directly across the pool area toward him while everybody watched. Then she started screaming, not yelling normally, actually screaming at the top of her lungs. She pointed directly at him and started shouting that he liked drowning children, that he had tried to drown me, that he was a creep, that parents should keep their kids away from him. The entire pool area went silent. Every single person turned to stare. The guy immediately panicked. You know those moments where somebody suddenly realizes everybody around them is looking at them, like they might be dangerous? Apparently, that was exactly what happened. He tried to get out of the pool as quickly as possible, while my cousin kept screaming after him. But in his rush, his swim trunks slipped down almost completely as he climbed out. And suddenly, the entire pool burst into laughter. Kids laughed, adults laughed, teenagers laughed, everybody. It completely destroyed whatever dignity he had left in that moment. I still remember the strange feeling of fear mixing with satisfaction watching it happen. Like suddenly this scary adult did not look powerful anymore. He looked pathetic, embarrassed, exposed. And after that day, I never saw him again. Maybe he finally realized people were paying attention to him. Maybe he was just too humiliated to come back. Whatever the reason, he disappeared from our lives completely after that. For years, I thought that would be the only creepy experience I had involving strangers. Then the Cancun trip happened. I had just turned 13 when my mom somehow managed to scrape together enough money for us to go to Cancun. To this day, I do not know how she pulled it off financially. I later learned she had borrowed money and found some unbelievably cheap vacation deal because she wanted to give my sister and me a real trip somewhere beautiful. Looking back now as an adult, I appreciate that so much more than I did at the time. At 13, you mostly just think vacations magically happen. You do not realize parents are stressing over bills the entire time. The resort itself felt incredible to me back then. Bright blue water, huge pools, tourists everywhere, music constantly playing, people carrying drinks around all day. It felt huge compared to anything I was used to growing up around. My sister and I spent most of the trip wandering around the resort by ourselves. Not recklessly far away, but enough that we felt independent and grown up. Honestly, that was pretty common for the time. Parents were a little less paranoid back then. Most days were completely normal. Swimming, eating random food from carts, watching shows, exploring pathways around the hotel. Nothing creepy at all. Then one day, this older couple started talking to me near one of the pools. At first, they seemed harmless, friendly even. The woman smiled a lot and the man joked around constantly. They acted like one of those chatty vacation couples who talked to everyone around them. I did not think anything about it initially. They asked simple questions. Where are you from? Are you having fun? Do you like swimming? Normal stuff. I already knew how to swim a little, but I was not very good at it, and they started giving me advice whenever they saw me in the pool. How to float better, how to move my arms properly, things like that. At first I thought they were just being nice. One day I was swimming around underwater in circles because I was a weird 13-year-old trying to entertain myself. They laughed and said I swam like a dolphin. For some reason, my brain instantly responded with, "No, I'm an alligator trying to twist someone's arm off." I thought it was hilarious. They absolutely did not. The couple immediately looked offended and started lecturing me about how disturbing that was to say. I remember feeling confused because I was literally just making dumb kid jokes. But even after that awkward moment, they still acted overly interested in me. That is when things started feeling strange. Every time they saw me afterward, they would come talk to me again. Not casually either, intensely. They remembered tiny details I had mentioned before and brought them back up later. Stuff about where I lived, stuff about my hobbies, stuff about my family. At first I thought they were just really attentive people. Then slowly it started feeling wrong. There is something deeply unsettling about adults who focus too hard on children they barely know, especially when they remember details most people would instantly forget. Eventually, I started actively avoiding them when I noticed them nearby, but they always found a way to approach me anyway. Then came the moment that still freaks me out to think about now. One afternoon, I was walking toward one of the outdoor food carts at the resort because I wanted something to eat. The couple spotted me and called me over immediately. I walked over mostly because I did not know how to politely ignore adults yet. That is something predators understand very well, by the way. Kids are taught to avoid being rude. Dangerous people use that. The couple had a container full of barbecue wings. They offered me some. Now, here is the funny thing that may have accidentally saved me from something awful. I absolutely hated barbecue sauce back then. Could not stand it, so I politely said no thank you. Instead of accepting the answer, they became extremely pushy. Not playful pushy, insistent. They kept trying to pressure me into eating them, telling me I should try them, saying I would love them, pushing the container closer toward me. The energy suddenly shifted completely. Every instinct in my body started screaming that something was wrong. Even at 13, I knew normal adults did not act like that over chicken wings. I had no idea what their intentions actually were, and maybe there was nothing dangerous at all, but every alarm bell in my head was going off. So I made up the first excuse I could think of. I told them my stomach hurt. Then I said I thought I was about to have diarrhea. Honestly, middle school humor probably helped me there because I figured adults would immediately stop talking to me if I mentioned that. Instead, they still kept trying to get me to stay. That was enough for me. I pretended I was run toward the bathrooms. But once I knew they were not directly watching me anymore, I slipped away and ran through the resort looking for my mom. When I found her, I told her everything. The couple, the weird conversations, the way they remembered details about me, the barbecue wings, how hard they pushed me to eat them. My mom instantly switched into protective mode. She took the styrofoam food container from my hands, marched straight to a trash can, and slammed it into the garbage. Then she demanded I point out exactly who they were. I did, and my mother absolutely unloaded on them. To this day, I honestly think scary mothers are more terrifying than almost anything else on earth. She marched directly up to them and started ripping into them so hard that nearby people started staring. She told them to stay away from me, told them they were behaving inappropriately, told them if she even heard they spoke to me again, she would involve the police immediately. The couple apparently tried acting confused and innocent, but my mom was not buying any of it. Afterward, she spoke to hotel staff, too, and made it very clear she did not want them anywhere near me. For the rest of the trip, she stayed close by whenever my sister and I were wandering around. And interestingly enough, the couple checked out of the hotel the very next day. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe they already planned to leave. But even years later, that timing still creeps me out. The older I get, the more disturbing both stories become to me. As a kid, you do not fully understand danger. You only understand feelings, confusion, fear, discomfort, instinct. But as an adult, you start recognizing patterns in behavior that children cannot fully explain. Adults becoming too interested in children they do not know. Adults trying to isolate kids from parents. Adults pushing boundaries repeatedly to see what they can get away with. That is the part that sticks with me now. Not dramatic horror movie moments. Just the realization that sometimes bad people move through ordinary places completely unnoticed while everybody around them assumes they are harmless. The story was told to me years ago by a guy I used to work with, and even now I still think about how unbelievably close two people came to a disaster without realizing it until afterward. What makes it so disturbing is not that somebody got hurt. Nobody actually did. The terrifying part is that they easily could have, and for several minutes neither of them had any idea how close death really was. The guy in the story was one of those people who lived and breathed guns. Not in a criminal way or anything like that. He was just deeply obsessed with firearms. The type of person who spent hours online arguing about calibers, cleaning routines, safety procedures, custom parts, and ammunition brands. He collected pistols, rifles, holsters, old military pieces, and random accessories most people would not even recognize. His apartment apparently looked more like a small workshop than a normal place to live. According to my coworker, the guy took firearms safety extremely seriously too. That was the strange part. He was not reckless in the usual sense. He was the kind of gun owner who corrected other people constantly. If someone pointed even an unloaded weapon in the wrong direction, he would instantly react. If someone touched a trigger carelessly, he would lecture them. He followed every rule religiously. Always treat the gun as loaded. Never point it at anything you are unwilling to destroy. Keep your finger off the trigger. Check the chamber repeatedly. That kind of person. Which somehow makes what happened even worse. One night he had a woman over at his apartment. From what I heard, they were not dating seriously. It was more of a casual hookup situation. They had apparently met recently, hit it off, and she came over to spend the night. At some point before things became physical, he had been cleaning one of his pistols at the kitchen table. That part alone already creates a weird image in my head. Most people would probably hide something like that before company came over, but for him it was apparently normal. Guns were such an everyday part of his life that he did not even think twice about leaving the disassembled pistol laid out in pieces while they talked and drank. The slide was off. The magazine was out. Cleaning supplies were spread across the table. To him, it probably looked no different than leaving tools out after working on a car. The woman noticed it almost immediately. Apparently, instead of being uncomfortable, she became fascinated by it. She started asking questions about the gun, how it worked, whether it was loaded, if he carried it often, things like that. He answered casually because to him it was just another conversation. Then the mood shifted. According to the story, once they started fooling around, she suddenly brought up wanting to act out some kind of violent fantasy involving the gun. Not actually violent in the sense of wanting harm done to her, but one of those dangerous role-play situations where fear and control become part of the excitement. From what my coworker said, the guy immediately felt uncomfortable about it. Not morally uncomfortable exactly, more like deeply nervous. Because again, despite being obsessed with firearms, He also understood better than most people how dangerous they actually were. He knew every horror story, accidental discharges, negligent shootings, people thinking a weapon was unloaded when it was not, couples fooling around and somebody ending up dead because one tiny step had been skipped. He apparently told her no at first, or at least tried to redirect things away from that idea, but she kept insisting. At first, she just wanted him to hold it, then point it at her, then use it as part of the role play. The more nervous he became, the more excited she apparently got, which only pushed the situation further. Now, obviously, from the outside looking in, the correct answer should have been simple. Put the gun away. End of discussion. But people do stupid things when sex enters the equation. People ignore instincts they would normally trust. They cross boundaries they normally would not. They convince themselves something dangerous is safe because they want to keep the moment going. That is exactly what happened here. Eventually he gave in, not because he really wanted to, more because he decided he could control the situation safely. At least that is what he thought. He reassembled the pistol while she watched. Even during that process, according to my coworker, he was supposedly still trying to act responsibly. He checked the weapon, cleared it, removed the magazine, worked the slide, checked again. Everything you are supposed to do. At least everything he thought he was supposed to do. The problem with routines is that people stop truly seeing what they are doing after enough repetition. Motions become automatic. Your brain fills in gaps without you realizing it. Somewhere during that process, one single round remained in the chamber. He did not notice. Maybe he became distracted. Maybe he thought he had already cleared it. Maybe the lighting was poor. Maybe he simply made the kind of mistake humans sometimes make. Whatever happened, the gun was not empty, but he believed it was. And that belief nearly destroyed 2 lives. The role play continued. At first, it was apparently small things, holding the weapon, pointing it near her, talking, playing into the fantasy she wanted. Even then, every single firearm safety rule he had ever learned was being violated one after another. Never point a gun at a person. Never use a weapon during emotional or sexual situations. Never rely solely on memory when checking if a firearm is loaded. Never assume. Every rule existed because somebody somewhere had died after ignoring it. But in the moment, people convinced themselves they are different. Accidents happen to somebody else. The woman became more and more into it as things escalated. Meanwhile, he was nervous the entire time. Not because he knew the gun was loaded. Because he believed it was unloaded but still understood how dangerous even pretending with a weapon could become. That should have been enough to stop, but it was not. According to the story, near the end of everything, she asked him to pull the trigger while pointing it at her. Even hearing that makes my stomach tighten, because at that point, there was literally a live round sitting in the chamber between life and death, and neither of them knew it. He hesitated. Apparently he argued for a second, but she kept pushing. She wanted the realism of the moment, the fear, the adrenaline. Finally he gave in. He pointed the pistol at her, pulled the trigger, click, nothing happened. The gun failed to fire. And she, thinking the empty click was part of the experience, reached her peak emotionally right at that moment. Then everything ended normally. That is the horrifying part. There was no dramatic reveal right away. No loud bang. No screaming. No blood. No immediate understanding of how close they had come to catastrophe. Instead, they simply calmed down afterward like countless other couples probably do after a night together. They talked, cleaned up, relaxed. Eventually, she left the apartment completely unaware that she had nearly been shot in the head. He apparently stayed behind and began cleaning the pistol again later. And that is when he discovered it. He disassembled the weapon, looked inside, and found the round still sitting there. The primer had a dent in it from the firing pin. The gun had actually tried to fire. The bullet had malfunctioned. One defective round had prevented a death. That detail is what stuck with me the most. Not an empty chamber. Not a safety mechanism. Not good decision-making at the last second. Pure luck, a bad bullet. That was the only thing separating that night from becoming a homicide investigation. Imagine realizing that afterward. Imagine sitting alone in your apartment, holding that damaged round in your hand and understanding what almost happened. One tiny difference, and he would have blown a hole through a woman's skull during a hookup. One fraction of a second and his entire life would have ended in prison, trauma, guilt, and horror. And the worst part is that it would not even have been intentional murder. That is what makes these stories so terrifying. Real tragedy often does not come from evil people planning terrible things. Sometimes it comes from ordinary people making one unbelievably stupid decision, while convinced they still have control. My coworker said the guy completely changed afterward. Apparently, the experience shook him harder than anything else ever had. He stopped showing off guns casually, stopped treating them like toys or personality accessories, stopped mixing firearms with drinking, dating, or anything emotional at all. For a while, he supposedly considered getting rid of all his weapons entirely because he could not stop replaying the moment in his head. The click, that single harmless little sound. Because once he knew the truth, the sound probably transformed into something else entirely. Not relief, not excitement, a ghost of a gunshot that should have happened. And honestly, I understand why it haunted him. Most people go through life assuming there is always some huge dramatic warning before disaster happens. They imagine flashing signs, obvious danger, loud moments where everybody suddenly realizes things are going wrong. But real life is often quieter than that. Sometimes death sits invisibly in a room while people laugh. Sometimes one tiny mechanical failure is the only reason somebody survives. And sometimes people do not even realize how close they came until afterward, when it is far too late to undo what they already chose to risk. That is what makes this story feel so disturbing to me years later. Not violence, not gore, just the horrible realization that two people casually wandered right up to the edge of irreversible tragedy and survived entirely because a defective piece of metal failed at exactly the right moment. About 6 years ago, I went on a missionary trip to southern Brazil, and even now I still think about one particular night that happened there. I have experienced plenty of creepy or strange moments in my life since then, but nothing has ever stuck with me the same way this did, because to this day I honestly cannot explain it logically. The area where we were stationed was rough. Not bad neighborhood rough in the way people casually describe places back home. I mean genuinely dangerous. There were constant stories about robberies, drug activity, gang violence, and random assaults. Gunshots at night were not unusual. Everyone living there seemed to know somebody who had either disappeared, been attacked, or gotten involved with the wrong people. As missionaries, we traveled everywhere in pairs for safety reasons. We were never supposed to be alone, especially after dark. Most nights we tried to get back early, but sometimes we stayed out later than expected, visiting people or walking long distances between neighborhoods. One evening my companion and I were heading back after dark. I still remember the atmosphere of that walk so clearly, because the whole night felt strangely heavy from the beginning. The air was humid, the streets were mostly empty, and the neighborhood had that eerie nighttime silence where every sound seems louder than normal. Dogs barked somewhere far away, music echoed faintly from distant houses, and every once in a while a motorcycle would roar past before everything went quiet again. There was one section of road we always hated walking through. It was probably only about 50 yards long, maybe a little more, but it felt much longer at night. The road cut along a steep hill and was partially under construction, so there were almost no working lights there. Parts of the sidewalk were broken up, dirt and loose gravel-covered sections of the ground, and unfinished concrete barriers sat along the roadside like dark shapes in the shadows. During the daytime, it just looked ugly. At night, it felt wrong. The darkness there was thick enough that you could barely see farther than a few feet ahead. Once you stepped onto that stretch of road, the rest of the neighborhood almost disappeared behind you. Now, here is the part that makes the whole story weird. I have experienced déjà vu my entire life, but not in the normal, quick way most people describe it. For me, it always feels connected to dreams. Sometimes I dream random moments weeks or months before they happen, then suddenly real life lines up perfectly with the dream later on. Usually it only lasts 10 or 15 seconds. I will suddenly recognize a conversation, a movement, or a situation exactly as I dreamed it before. When it happens, I can briefly predict what somebody is about to say or do because I already experienced it in the dream. It is strange, but normally harmless. More of a weird whoa moment than anything serious. That night in Brazil was completely different. As my companion and I approached the dark hill road, I suddenly felt that familiar sensation hit me. It started subtly at first, a weird sinking feeling in my stomach, that strange pressure in my head. Then reality began syncing up with something I had dreamed before. Every step started feeling familiar. The angle of the road, the darkness, the exact sound of our shoes against the pavement. Then my companion suddenly stopped walking beside me. He looked genuinely nervous, not joking around nervous either. Real fear. And then he said the exact words from my dream. "Dude, I don't feel good, like something is off. Are you feeling anything?" The second he spoke, every hair on my body stood up, because I knew exactly what came next. I remember turning toward him slowly and saying, "I had a dream about this." Immediately, he looked confused. "What?" And then, almost automatically, I answered with the exact memory from the dream. "Yeah, I had a dream where you said that exact same thing. Then we crossed the street right here, and two guys pulled knives on us and jumped us." The second I said it out loud, the atmosphere completely changed. Up until then, the conversation had almost felt interesting in a weird way. But now both of us were fully aware of how dark and isolated that road actually was. My companion started freaking out immediately. I had honestly never seen him look that scared before. He kept looking around into the darkness while saying we needed to leave right now. He wanted to take a completely different route home immediately, even though it would add a lot more walking time. Meanwhile, my stupid, overconfident self reacted completely differently. At the time, I was young and thought the whole thing was almost exciting. Part of me genuinely believed the déjà vu was some kind of advanced warning system. My logic was basically, if we already know we are about to get jumped, then maybe we can prepare ourselves and fight back. Looking back now, that confidence was unbelievably dumb. We were two young guys in a dangerous area, walking alone at night in unfamiliar street. If there really had been armed criminals waiting there, things could have gone very badly very fast. My companion kept insisting we needed to avoid that road. Eventually, mostly because he was so shaken up, I agreed. So instead of crossing through the dark hill area, we took a completely different way home. The alternate route was longer and forced us through several extra streets, but it stayed better lit and closer to populated areas. The entire walk afterward felt tense. I remember both of us constantly looking over our shoulders and half expecting something bad to happen anyway. Every shadow suddenly looked suspicious. Every distant voice sounded threatening. Neither of us joked much after that conversation. But we made it home safely. Nothing happened. No attackers. No knives. No robbery. Eventually we calmed down and mostly laughed it off. My companion still thought the whole thing was terrifying. But after a while I convinced myself it had probably just been a coincidence mixed with paranoia from being in a rough neighborhood. Life continued normally after that. A few months later I eventually left that area and moved on. Then sometime afterward I heard news from people who were still there. Apparently 6 people had been killed on or around that same street after I left. Most of the murders were supposedly connected to drug activity and gang violence. Several people had reportedly been executed over money or territorial disputes. The neighborhood was already dangerous when we lived there, but apparently things became even worse later. Hearing that news brought the memory of that night rushing back instantly. And suddenly the whole thing stopped feeling funny, because even if the exact dream scenario never happened, the reality was still clear. We had been walking through an area where violent people absolutely existed. People really were getting attacked and killed there. To this day, I still think about what might have happened if we ignored that feeling and walked down the dark hill road anyway. Maybe nothing would have happened. Maybe the dream was meaningless coincidence. Or maybe there really were 2 guys waiting somewhere nearby that night. The creepiest part is how perfectly the conversation lined up with the dream beforehand. Not vague similarities either. Exact words, exact setting, exact feeling. I can still remember the shock of hearing my companion say the same sentence from the dream and realizing reality was syncing up in real time. What also stayed with me afterward was realizing how powerful human instincts can be. Even before I mentioned the dream, my companion already felt something was wrong. His body sensed danger before either of us consciously understood why. Sometimes people pick up on tiny environmental details subconsciously without realizing it. Silence, movement, tension, the absence of other people. Your brain notices danger before your conscious thoughts catch up. Or maybe it was something stranger than that. Honestly, I do not know. I am not someone who claims to have supernatural powers or anything dramatic like that. I cannot explain why déjà vu happens to me the way it does. Most of the time it is harmless and lasts only seconds. But that night in Brazil was different. It was longer, sharper, more detailed. And unlike every other deja vu moment I had experienced before, it involved a direct warning about violence. For years afterward, I kept replaying it in my head, wondering what would have happened if we kept walking down that road. Would two guys really have stepped out with knives? Would we have gotten robbed, stabbed, killed? Or was the dream simply my brain connecting fear and coincidence together afterward? I honestly cannot answer that, but I do know this. We changed our route because something inside both of us felt deeply wrong. And later we learned multiple people were murdered on that same street. Maybe it was coincidence, or maybe sometimes your mind notices danger long before you fully understand it yourself. When my best friend first started dating him, almost everyone in our friend group disliked the guy immediately. Nobody could fully explain why at the time, which honestly made it harder to talk about. If someone is openly violent or clearly dangerous, it is easy to point at specific behavior and say, "See? That's the problem." But with him, it was more subtle in the beginning. He just gave people this constant uneasy feeling. He acted arrogant all the time, like everyone around him was slightly beneath him. Conversations with him always felt uncomfortable because he had this strange habit of staring too intensely without really reacting emotionally. Even when he smiled, it never fully reached his eyes. He could be charming for a few minutes if he wanted to be, especially around new people. But eventually the mask would slip and people would start feeling uneasy around him. Most of us just called him an asshole because that was the easiest way to describe it. At the time, though, none of us imagined he was genuinely dangerous. My best friend seemed really into him during those first few months. Looking back, I think part of the attraction came from how confident he seemed. Some people mistake coldness for confidence when they are younger. He always acted calm, composed, and completely sure of himself. Meanwhile, the rest of us were awkward 20-somethings trying to figure life out. Compared to normal guys our age, he probably seemed mature and intense. But something about him always bothered me. Even before anything happened, I avoided being alone with him whenever possible. I noticed he got weirdly touchy sometimes, especially after drinking. Not enough that anyone could easily call him out publicly, but enough to make women subtly move away from him during parties. There were moments where I caught him watching people instead of participating in conversations, almost like he was studying them. Still, life went on normally. We all hung out together at parties, bars, and apartment get-togethers. My best friend stayed with him, despite occasional arguments and complaints from people who did not like his attitude. I tried not to interfere too much because nobody wants to become the friend who hates the boyfriend. Then one night, something happened that completely changed how I saw him. My friend had people over at her place for a small party. Nothing huge, just friends drinking, listening to music, and hanging out late into the night. Everybody was relaxed and having fun. At some point, people started leaving in groups, grabbing coats and saying goodbye near the front door. I was heading out too when it happened. As I walked past him near the doorway, he suddenly grabbed my ass. Not accidentally, not in some quick, playful way that could be misunderstood. He fully grabbed me while smirking like he thought it was funny. I remember freezing from shock for maybe half a second before immediately shoving his hand away. I felt disgusted and angry instantly. What disturbed me most was his reaction afterward. He did not look embarrassed at all. He just gave this smug little smile, like he enjoyed making people uncomfortable, and expected me not to say anything because he was dating my best friend. That expression honestly stayed in my mind longer than the actual grabbing itself. It was the look of someone testing boundaries. My friend noticed something happened because she saw my reaction. Later she asked me what was wrong, and after debating with myself for a while, I finally told her the truth. I explained exactly what he did, and admitted that I genuinely thought he was creepy. She did not take it very well at first, not furious exactly, but defensive and irritated. I think hearing criticism about someone you love automatically makes people want to defend them, especially when they are emotionally invested. She asked if maybe he was just drunk and being stupid. She said maybe I was overreacting. But even while defending him, I could tell she was bothered by it. I remember telling her very clearly that I did not trust him and that something about him felt wrong to me. For a while, things between us became slightly awkward because of that conversation. Nobody likes feeling caught between their best friend and their boyfriend. Still, not long afterward, she ended up breaking up with him anyway. According to her, the relationship had already started becoming unhealthy before I said anything. He was controlling, moody, and had a temper she increasingly found unsettling. Once they broke up, everybody moved on with life. Years passed. People got older, changed jobs, moved cities, started new relationships. He basically became one of those unpleasant people from the past nobody thinks about anymore. Every once in a while, his name might come up briefly in conversation, but mostly he disappeared from our lives completely. Then one day, years later, my best friend sent me a message completely out of nowhere. It included a link to a newspaper article and one sentence underneath it. "Thank you for being honest with me all those years ago. You were looking out for me, but we didn't know it at the time." The second I read that message, I felt nervous before even opening the article, and then I read it. According to the news report, her ex-boyfriend had recently been arrested after one of several victims managed to escape from his apartment and go to police. What investigator discovered afterward sounded like something out of a nightmare. The article explained that he had allegedly been luring women back to his apartment, drugging them, and imprisoning them inside a hidden compartment he built underneath the floor. I remember physically stopping while reading because my brain genuinely struggled to process those words. A hidden compartment under the floor. It sounded unreal. Apparently, the compartment had been carefully concealed so visitors would never notice it casually. One victim somehow managed to escape long enough to contact police, and after his arrest, several more women reportedly came forward, claiming he had done similar things to them. The entire story felt horrifyingly surreal, because I could still picture him standing casually at parties with all of us years earlier. The same guy drinking beer in somebody's kitchen and making sarcastic jokes had secretly been doing unimaginable things behind closed doors. I immediately called my friend after reading the article. She sounded deeply shaken. Not just scared, but disturbed in this heavy emotional way that happens when someone suddenly realizes they narrowly escaped something terrible. She kept saying she felt sick thinking about all the time she had been alone with him. Then she told me something that honestly gave me chills. She said that during their relationship, she had always avoided accepting drinks from him whenever she was alone at his apartment. Not because she consciously thought he would drug her. She just never wanted to. She could not explain it logically at the time. Whenever he offered her a mixed drink or handed her something already prepared, she instinctively resisted it. Sometimes she would make excuses and open her own drink instead. Other times she would pretend she was not thirsty. According to her, it was never a deliberate decision, just a strange feeling she could not shake. After reading the article, though, she became convinced her instincts had been warning her years before she consciously understood why. That part haunted me almost more than the arrest itself. Because how many times do people sense danger subconsciously but talk themselves out of listening to it? Especially women. Society constantly teaches people not to seem rude, paranoid, dramatic, or judgmental. So many people ignore uncomfortable instincts because they worry about offending someone or causing tension. Looking back afterwards, so many details about him suddenly felt darker. The way he pushed boundaries casually. The way he touched people without permission. The way he watched others too carefully. The strange emotional coldness he sometimes had during conversations. Even the expression on his face, after grabbing me, suddenly took on a completely different meaning. At the time, I thought he was just a creepy jerk testing boundaries because he was drunk and arrogant. But afterward, it felt more sinister. Like he genuinely enjoyed violating people's comfort and seeing what he could get away with. Predators rarely look like monsters at first. That is what makes stories like this so disturbing. Most dangerous people do not walk around acting openly evil 24 hours a day. They date people. They go to parties. They have normal conversations. They laugh at jokes. They blend into ordinary life surprisingly well. Sometimes the only warning signs are subtle feelings people dismiss too easily. My friend later admitted there were other moments during their relationship where she felt deeply uncomfortable around him for reasons she could never fully explain. Certain moods he got into frightened her a little. Sometimes he became strangely emotionless during arguments. Other times he acted overly charming immediately after upsetting her. At the time, she convinced herself she was imagining things. After the arrest, all those memories changed completely. I remember sitting alone after reading the article and thinking about how differently life could have turned out. What if she had ignored her instincts completely? What if she had stayed with him longer? What if she had accepted one of those drinks she always avoided? Those thoughts genuinely made me sick. The story stayed with me because it completely changed how seriously I take gut feelings. Sometimes your brain notices tiny warning signs before you consciously understand them. Sometimes you cannot logically explain why someone feels dangerous, but that feeling exists for a reason. And honestly, I still think about the message she sent me after all those years. Thank you for being honest with me. Because back then, I thought I was only warning her that her boyfriend was a creep. Neither of us realized I might actually have been warning her about something much worse.
If you've stayed with me this far, then these stories didn't simply pass the time. They stayed with you. Everything you heard tonight was real. Real people. Real moments. And in each one, something quietly slipped out of place. If you'd like more of the kind that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Crowvane Manor. There are more rooms left open and more stories waiting behind every door. I'm grateful you spent this part of your night here. Rest well, and I'll be waiting when you return.